Sarah Ferguson has spent years trying to rebuild her image, but one new document dump just dragged her name straight back into the darkest scandal on the planet. Because according to newly resurfaced emails, the former Duchess of York wasn't just casually connected to Jeffrey Epstein, she was allegedly emotionally attached to him. Not before the world knew who he was, not before the conviction, but after he had already been sentenced for crimes involving minors. And what makes this even harder to explain is that the messages don't just show her asking for help, they show her chasing him for money, attention, and access in a way that reads less like networking and more like dependence. But the real reason this story is exploding again isn't even the flirty lines or the desperate tone. It's the timing, it's the way her daughters are mentioned, and it's the growing belief that the palace is now scrambling behind the scenes to contain what could come next. So if you think you already know the full story, you don't. Because once you see what these emails allegedly reveal and what happened in the days immediately after Epstein walked free, the entire situation becomes almost impossible to defend. And before we get into the timeline that has people completely stunned, make sure you subscribe, because the deeper you go into this scandal, the more disturbing it gets. Here's the detail that makes this entire scandal explode. It's not just that Sarah Ferguson knew Jeffrey Epstein, it's when she kept engaging with him. Because by the time these exchanges were happening, Epstein wasn't some mysterious billionaire socialite. He was already a convicted sex offender. And most people, once that conviction hit in 2008, quietly disappeared from his orbit. Phones stopped ringing, invites stopped coming, friendships suddenly evaporated. But that's not what happened here. And once you see the timing, it becomes almost impossible to ignore. Because the communication didn't happen years before the scandal, it happened after the conviction, after the prison sentence, after the world knew. And that's where this shifts from awkward to deeply uncomfortable. But the timing alone isn't what stunned people. It's what allegedly happened just days after he walked free. 5 days, that's all it took. Within 5 days of Epstein's release, there were reports that Sarah was offering to meet him, even discussing bringing her daughters along. Not before prison, not during some distant past, after. And if you're thinking that can't be right, that reaction is exactly why this story reignited. Because 5 days doesn't feel like bad judgment, it feels intentional. But it doesn't stop there, because right after his release, there were discussions about travel, flights, Miami, and the uncomfortable question of who was footing the bill. Now, no one waves a receipt on camera, but when travel lines up almost immediately after a conversation about paying for it, people draw conclusions, and those conclusions are brutal. Because this starts to look less like coincidence and more like dependency. And here's where it gets even more troubling. This wasn't just about casual meetups. There were conversations about showing Epstein's associates around royal property, access to Buckingham Palace, access that very few people on Earth are granted. And the question wasn't just whether Sarah could arrange it, it was whether her daughters would be there too. That's the moment the tone shifts completely. Because once royal access, money, and young daughters enter the same conversation, the public reaction stops being curious, it becomes furious. And just when you think the timeline couldn't look worse, the emails themselves make it even harder to defend. Because the words used weren't distant, they weren't cautious, they were personal. And once we break those down, you'll understand why this story isn't fading anytime soon. This is where the story stops being about connections and starts looking like attachment. Because once you get into the emails, the tone isn't professional, it isn't distant, it isn't even careful. It's emotional, and in some places it's downright desperate. One of the lines that instantly jumped out to people was when Sarah reportedly referred to Epstein as her pillar. Not a contact, not a wealthy friend, not a useful connection. Her pillar. And that one word matters because it suggests this wasn't just about money, it was about dependence. But the emails don't stop at emotional language, they escalate fast. Because she wasn't just praising him, she was chasing him. At one point, she allegedly wrote, "I am at your service." And when you read that, it doesn't sound like casual friendship. It sounds like someone trying to stay in someone's good graces, someone with power, someone with money, someone who can provide something she needs. And then came the line that made people freeze. "Just marry me." Now, sure, someone could argue it was playful, but playful doesn't land the same when you're saying it to a man who was already convicted. Instead, it reads like someone trying to cling to a lifeline. And that's where the next email changes the entire story. Because she didn't just want affection, she wanted employment. According to the messages being discussed, she asked him, "When are you going to employ me?" And that's the moment the dynamic becomes crystal clear, because now it isn't just friendly emails, it's someone openly pushing for a job, money, or a financial arrangement with a man whose name should have been untouchable. But even that isn't what made the public reaction explode. It's what she wrote right after. She reportedly told him, "You are a legend," and then went even further. "I really don't have the words to describe my love, gratitude for your generosity and kindness." Just think about that. She's thanking him for generosity. She's expressing love, and she's doing it long after the world knew what he was. So the question becomes brutal. Was she blinded by desperation, or did she simply not care? And the emails get even stranger, because they weren't just private flattery, they involved her daughters. In one message, she reportedly thanked him for complimenting her in front of my girls, and that detail lands like a punch, because if she was comfortable having him around her daughters, then she wasn't treating him like a danger, she was treating him like a trusted insider. And that's when the emails cross into territory that feels genuinely disturbing, because one of the lines that resurfaced sounded shockingly casual. She reportedly wrote that she was waiting for Eugenie to return from a shagging weekend. And people immediately asked the obvious question, why would you ever say that to Jeffrey Epstein? Why would you mention your daughter's private life to him? And why would you speak like you're gossiping with a close friend? But the most humiliating detail in this entire email trail is what Epstein said about her behind her back. Because while she was praising him, thanking him, and chasing him, he was privately mocking her. In one message discussed in your transcript, Epstein sent someone a link about Princess Beatrice's graduation, and he referred to Sarah in a cruel, dismissive way, basically insulting her appearance. And that changes the tone completely, because it suggests she was pouring out admiration to a man who didn't respect her at all, which raises an even darker possibility. If she wasn't being valued as a friend, then what was she being used for? And once we get into how the daughters were allegedly being positioned in this relationship, you'll understand why commentators called it gut-churning. This is where the story stops feeling messy and starts feeling disturbing. Because up until now, you could argue poor judgment. You could argue financial desperation. You could even argue loneliness. But once her daughters enter the picture, those defenses get a lot harder to make. And that's exactly why this is the part that triggered the strongest reaction. Because the emails didn't just show communication, they showed comfort. Comfort that many people believe should never have existed. In one message, she purportedly thanked Epstein for complimenting her in front of my girls. On its own, that line might not seem explosive, but context changes everything. By this point, his conviction was public knowledge, his reputation was toxic, and yet the tone wasn't cautious, it was appreciative. And that's when people started asking the uncomfortable question. If she knew who he was, why keep him around her daughters at all? But the timeline makes it even harder to brush off. Because this wasn't ancient history. This was after prison, after the charges, after the world had already recoiled. And then came the travel detail. There were discussions about flights, about Miami, about who might be covering expenses. Now again, no one waves a signed receipt in front of the camera, but when flights are discussed and travel happens shortly after, it creates a narrative that's difficult to ignore. And that narrative isn't flattering. Because it suggests reliance, it suggests access being traded for support. And once that perception forms, it spreads fast. But the detail that truly made commentators recoil wasn't just travel, it was access. Because there were conversations about showing Epstein's associates around Buckingham Palace, royal grounds, one of the most protected institutions in the world. And the question purportedly wasn't just whether Sarah could host, it was whether her daughters would also be present. That's the moment the tone shifts from scandal to something far darker. Because once royal access, wealthy associates, and young daughters intersect, people stop giving the benefit of the doubt. And that's why one commentator used language so harsh it shocked viewers. They suggested it looked almost like she was offering them as part of the package. Now that is an allegation, not a proven fact. But the reason it was even said out loud is because the optics are that uncomfortable. And optics are everything in a scandal like this. Because perception becomes reality faster than legal conclusions ever do. But here's what makes this even more volatile. If these communications were known internally, then the palace has likely been aware of this dynamic for years, which means the recent reaction from the monarchy may not be surprise, it may be damage control. And if that's true, then what happened behind closed doors right after the latest document release starts to make a lot more sense. Because the response wasn't subtle, it was decisive.
When you step back and look at the full picture, 3 things stand out. First, the timing. These weren't distant, decades-old interactions buried in the past. The communication happened after Epstein's conviction, after the world knew, and that alone is why the backlash feels so intense. Second, the tone. The language in those emails didn't sound cautious, it didn't sound guarded, it sounded personal, emotional, even dependent. And when that tone is directed at someone already publicly disgraced, it raises questions that don't go away easily. And third, the fallout. The reported emergency meetings, the Royal Lodge drama, the quiet movements behind palace walls. Whether you believe it's coincidence or containment, the reaction suggests this isn't something the monarchy can simply ignore. But here's the part that keeps this story alive. We still don't know everything. More documents could surface, more allegations could emerge, more internal decisions could be exposed. And if that happens, this won't just be a reputational issue, it could reshape how people view the institution itself. So now the question isn't just what happened, it's what happens next. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because when new details drop, we'll be here to unpack them clearly and calmly. And I want to hear from you. Do you think this was reckless desperation or calculated damage control that simply backfired? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about it.